58 seconds. One insult. A $100 million response that shook the soul of Congress. Jasmine Crockett thought she could humiliate Ibrahim Traoré live on national TV. But what happened less than a minute later left a nation stunned and a system exposed. The sun crept slowly over the Capitol dome, casting a golden hue across the marble buildings and manicured lawns of Washington, D.C. It was one of those late autumn mornings, crisp clear and deceptively calm. The city buzzed as it always did with the slow churn of bureaucracy cloaked in tailored suits and muted power moves. Inside Suite 1423 of the Cannon House office building, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was finishing her second espresso and reviewing her speaking notes for a midday press briefing. Education equity, she muttered under her breath, thumbing through a highlighted memo. Tone passionate but not militant. Her assistant Clara Young-Sharp, always 2 steps ahead, entered with a file in hand and a peculiar look on her face. "Something strange just came through legal," she said, voice carefully neutral. "A formal summons. International. From Burkina Faso." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. Burkina? What Clara handed her a crisp cream-colored envelope with an embossed seal official, foreign and oddly ceremonial. Jasmine tore it open with more curiosity than concern. Her eyes danced across the bold header, then froze. Ibrahim Traoré ver, Repier Jasmine Crockett. Demand for damages, $100,000, $1,000 USD filed by the Office of the President. Burkina Faso for public defamation, cultural defilement, and diplomatic misconduct. There was silence. Then Jasmine let out a sharp laugh, high-pitched, almost incredulous. $100 million? Are they serious? She chuckled, waving the document as if it were a piece of absurd fan fiction. What am I, Marvel's next villain? Clara didn't laugh. Neither did Mark, the chief of staff, who had just walked in and caught the tail end. Who's suing you? He asked. Jasmine handed it over. Some president from... What is it, West Africa? Mark read the name aloud. Ibrahim Traoré. That name landed with unexpected weight. Clara shifted her stance. Mark frowned. You don't know who he is, he asked cautiously. Traoré isn't just some president. He's the guy CNN called Africa's rising revolutionary. Youngest head of state on the continent, ex-military. Overthrew a regime last year. Very pro-Africa, anti-West. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. So what? He's got a fan club. Mark handed the document back. He's got a movement. But Jasmine, still smirking, dropped it onto her cluttered desk. Let the man scream into the void. I've got constituents who care about school lunches, not sandstorms and coups halfway around the world. Yet even as she said it, a flicker of discomfort crossed her face. A beat passed. Clara hesitated. There's something else, ma'am. The lawsuit, it references video evidence. Footage of you at a fundraiser last year. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. What video? Apparently you made a few off-the-cuff remarks about African leaders. Something about tin pot dictators in gold-plated uniforms. Jasmine waved it off. Everyone was drinking. It wasn't public. No recordings. But Clara didn't flinch. It was a live mic congresswoman. Someone clipped it. A hollow silence fell over the room. Jasmine leaned back in her leather chair, the gears turning behind her practiced smile. For the first time that morning, her espresso didn't taste quite right. The media hadn't touched it yet. Not CNN, not Politico, not even the Twitter trolls. But someone, Traoré himself, knew where to aim the arrow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows just slightly. A subtle warning, the kind Washington veterans learned to notice. Jasmine turned her chair toward the window and stared out at the Capitol dome. From a distance, everything still looked pristine, controlled. But inside, something had shifted, a fracture had formed. She prided herself on being a civil rights champion. She had marched, spoken, rallied for justice. Her base knew her as a fighter for the underrepresented. But behind closed doors, she was also something else, strategic, self-preserving, and occasionally dismissive of things she didn't think would matter politically. And Burkina Faso, in her mind, had never mattered until now. Back in her office, the lawsuit sat quietly on her desk. She hadn't realized it yet, but this was not a legal stunt. It was the spark to something far larger, a media storm waiting to detonate, and she was standing directly in its eye. The following morning, before Washington's political class had even finished their coffee, the world woke to something unexpected. A long, deliberate open letter authored by none other than President Ibrahim Traoré was published in English, French, and several African dialects across multiple international outlets. It appeared first in Al Jazeera, then Le Monde Afrique, and finally the New York Times International. The title was stark unmistakable. To the people of America, on sovereignty, respect, and the cost of silence. It began not with anger, but clarity. I write to you not as an enemy, but as a fellow believer in democracy. I write not to retaliate, but to remind. We do not seek pity, we seek parity. When a sitting member of the U.S. Congress refers to African leadership as a circus of tin pot dictators in gold-plated clown suits, we are not simply insulted, we are erased. It wasn't just the words that stung, it was the tone. Calm, surgical, presidential. Traoré's letter was a carefully crafted indictment not of Jasmine Crockett as a person, but of a mindset one that treated African nations as political props or charity cases never equals. He referenced not just Jasmine's quote, but the long history of Western paternalism dressed as diplomacy. He invoked Malcolm X, he quoted Baldwin, and he ended with a question: if we are good enough to be pitied, when will we be good enough to be heard within 2 hours? Nation Respect Africa was trending globally. By noon, someone unearthed the video. Grainy, clearly taken from a hidden phone, it showed Jasmine Crockett in a wine-red dress on a sleek rooftop in D.C., a glass of Pinot in one hand surrounded by high-level donors. It was an off-the-record fundraiser from last year, $10,000 a plate. She was mid-conversation, half laughing, as she said, "Honestly, I can't keep up with which general is president this week in West Africa. 1 minute it's a military coup, next minute they're all wearing medals like it's Halloween in the Sahara." There was awkward laughter in the background, a few clinks of silverware, but the damage was sealed in that single clip, that smirk, that dismissive tone, that line. It spread like wildfire. TikTokers turned it into sound bites. African-American influencers reposted the clip with captions like, "This is who speaks for us in Congress, Ghanaian celebrities weighed in." A Nigerian author called it the mask slipping on American diplomacy. Back in D.C., Jasmine's team scrambled to do damage control. A press release was drafted. Apologies were considered, then postponed. Clara suggested taking ownership, but Jasmine pushed back, still clinging to the belief that the news cycle would shift. But this was no typical scandal. This wasn't about gaffes or bad phrasing. It was about a wound reopened, one stitched together by centuries of colonial narratives, now being torn apart by one careless sentence, and a man bold enough to challenge it on a global stage. The first cracks had formed in Jasmine's armor. They were hairline thin, deniable. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The court of public opinion had just been summoned, and for the first time in her career, Jasmine Crockett was not in control of the script. By the third day, the quiet scandal had become a cultural earthquake. What began as a ripple on obscure foreign policy blogs now thundered across American screens, podcasts, group chats, and morning talk shows. Overnight, Twitter, now simply X, was ablaze. Hashtags flooded the platform like sparks across dry grass. Chantres Respect Africa, Chantres Traoré speaks, Chantres Clown Suit Diplomacy, Chantres Not My Congresswoman. Clips of the rooftop fundraiser video now carried subtitles in over a dozen languages. Major influencers across Africa, the Caribbean, and the U.S. diaspora voiced their outrage. One particularly damning tweet came from a respected African-American pastor with over 2 million followers. They love Africa when it's poor and quiet, but not when it speaks with pride. Traoré didn't just sue Jasmine, he sued the silence, and the silence was cracking. By mid-morning, Jasmine Crockett's communications team made a calculated decision: face the music, hold a press conference, control the narrative, get ahead of the storm. But the storm had already moved past her. She walked into the press room flanked by 2 aides and stood at the podium with the practiced confidence of someone who'd faced heated questions before. She wore navy strong neutral. Her tone was polished, her eyes alert. As many of you are aware, she began, a foreign head of state has filed a lawsuit against me over comments allegedly made in a private setting. Let me be clear, these remarks have been taken out of context, distorted, and weaponized for political theater. She paused for effect, scanning the room. Cameras flashed. No one blinked. I have always stood for human rights and international cooperation, she continued, but I will not allow propaganda to define my record. This is an attempt to undermine a sitting member of Congress based on rhetoric, not record. A few murmurs stirred in the back. Then came the mistake, the pivot from defense to offense. While I respect President Traoré's position, I question his motives. Leaders who silence journalists and militarize politics should not lecture America about dignity. The line hit hard and backfired harder. Within minutes, political analysts called it a catastrophic misstep. The statement wasn't just dismissive, it felt imperial. It felt arrogant. It confirmed to many exactly what the lawsuit accused her of: institutional disrespect masked as political judgment. The press conference ended in polite claps, but the real verdict was being typed, tweeted, clipped, and analyzed in real time by millions who were no longer passive observers. That evening, in stark contrast to Jasmine's podium performance, Ibrahim Traoré appeared live on the BBC's Global Spotlight. The anchor introduced him with a reverence usually reserved for Nobel Peace Laureates. Dressed in a modest suit, no medals, no flash, just gravity. Traoré smiled politely and greeted the audience in English. "Thank you for having me. I'm honored to speak not just for my country, but for a broader truth." The interview, though only 15 minutes long, reshaped the conversation. Traoré spoke not of vengeance, but values. He spoke of respect, of histories misrepresented, of nations dismissed before they could speak for themselves. His English was soft but fluent, his demeanor composed but piercing. When asked about Jasmine's press conference, he didn't flinch. "I believe the Congresswoman is under pressure. I do not take her defensiveness personally, but when one represents a democracy, one must know the weight of their words, especially when those words carry across oceans." The interviewer paused. "Mr. President, are you suggesting this is about more than personal offense?" Traoré nodded. "This is about precedent, about who gets to define dignity. If Africa is only respected when silent, then silence is no longer an option." By the end of the segment, social media lit up again, this time with a new wave of hashtags: Traoré 2024, Joshua Global Leadership, Joshua Let Africa Speak. Cable networks replayed the BBC clip on loop. Clips of Jasmine's press conference were now side by side with Traoré's calm, cutting response. The contrast was not in volume but in vision. People didn't just see a political dispute anymore. They saw a mirror held up to the American system and a quiet, unyielding figure on the other side of the world who had just changed the tone of the conversation one syllable at a time. The tipping point had come, and Jasmine Crockett was no longer leading the narrative. By the end of the week, it was clear that the courtroom wasn't the only battleground. The real trial was happening elsewhere, on television panels and Twitter, threads across kitchen tables and barbershops, and deep within the fractured soul of America's own cultural conscience. Jasmine Crockett's legal team took their first formal step, releasing a statement that branded the lawsuit as performative politics in international theater. The language was clipped carefully, nonchalant. "There is no jurisdiction, no substance, and no credibility," it read. "We will not dignify this spectacle with prolonged engagement." But that calculated dismissal only made things worse, because while Jasmine's lawyers tried to play the legal chessboard, the media had already moved on to a far more potent arena, the court of public opinion. Within 48 hours, major news outlets pivoted away from covering the he said, she said details of the lawsuit. They had found something far more compelling, the bigger conversation Traoré had quietly ignited. CNN booked an emergency roundtable on its weekend primetime slot titled, "The Global South Speaks What America Doesn't Understand About Africa." MSNBC launched a segment, "Empires Echo the New Colonial Narrative." Even Fox News weighed in, albeit with a predictably skeptical angle, inviting an ex-ambassador who called the controversy a distraction from America's real priorities. But it was on PBS that something truly powerful happened. A soft-spoken historian appeared, Dr. Asha Caldwell, a tenured professor of African American Studies at Howard University. In her 60s, with silver-streaked locks and eyes that carried decades of disappointment and wisdom, she didn't mince words. "This isn't just about one congresswoman making an ignorant joke," she said, folding her hands. "It's about what that joke revealed. Traoré's message resonates not because it's foreign, but because it's true. We've been fed caricatures of Africa for generations. Primitive, chaotic, corrupt. So when someone from that world speaks back with clarity, pride, and precision, it unnerves us. Especially when that voice is younger, more dignified, and more visionary than the people we've elected. The clip went viral overnight. On one side of the cultural aisle, there was admiration, especially among younger Black Americans, first and second generation immigrants and globalists. They saw in Traoré a reflection of something long yearned for a leader who didn't beg for Western validation, but demanded equality with poise. He's saying what our grandparents wanted to say, one user wrote. Not asking for charity, just asking to be respected. But on the other side, particularly among older civil rights veterans and establishment Democrats, there was discomfort and even resentment. They didn't like seeing Jasmine publicly dragged. Many had marched with people like her, donated to campaigns like hers, and voted for her out of trust. She's not perfect, one local NAACP chairwoman in Georgia told a morning news show, but she's ours. Traoré doesn't get the battles she's fought here. He doesn't live under American racism. He hasn't bled in these streets. The tension fractured families, friendships, even churches. Some preachers avoided the topic entirely, fearing division in the pews. Others leaned into it, using their Sunday sermons to reflect on the power of humility, the danger of pride, and the cost of silence. And somewhere in the middle were those trying to reconcile it all. A high school teacher in Detroit posted a video of her classroom discussion on the controversy. Her Black students debated fiercely, some defending Jasmine, others praising Traoré, but all deeply invested. I've never seen them talk this passionately about anything in global politics, she said. They feel this story because it's about them too. Meanwhile, Jasmine watched this unfolding storm from behind frosted glass and carefully curated press releases. She saw the hashtags. She saw the panels. She saw the historians, the influencers, the cultural icons, dissecting her legacy in real time. And the hardest part, no one was calling her a monster. They were calling her a symbol of something much older, much deeper, and much harder to escape. It wasn't just her words on trial anymore. It was the very tone of American authority. And that she was learning was a battle no legal team could manage and no podium could fix. As cable news wrestled with nuance and panel debates, the internet did what it always does, simplified, amplified, and turned the whole saga into a battleground of clips, memes, and moments. And in that arena, Jasmine was losing fast. TikTok users cut the infamous rooftop fundraiser video into 30-second snippets with dramatic zoom-ins, sarcastic captions, and duets where creators stared into the camera, mouths agape, eyebrows arched in disbelief. One user added circus music behind Jasmine's tin pot dictator remark. Another spliced her voice over actual footage of African heads of state in military uniform, highlighting the cultural ignorance buried in the joke. Within hours, the meme was everywhere. But it wasn't just jokes, it was commentary with teeth. Podcasters across the diaspora picked up the thread. Ghanaian-American host Kojo Owusu, known for his razor-sharp takes, dropped a 2-hour episode titled The Microaggressions of Global Power. He broke down not just the lawsuit, but its symbolism. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about dignity, about who gets to speak and who gets dismissed when they do. The episode climbed to Spotify's top 10 in the news and politics category in under 24 hours. Then came the wave of remixes. A South African DJ turned Traoré's BBC quote, "If Africa is only respected when silent, then silence is no longer an option," into a house beat that exploded on SoundCloud. The track was soon used in over 300,000 TikTok videos, paired with clips of African architecture student protests and Jasmine's worst sound bites. And then there was Toby Adekoya, a 22-year-old Nigerian YouTuber with an easy smile and the charisma of a born storyteller. From his small plant-filled bedroom in Lagos, he uploaded a 9-minute video titled "The Day Africa Stood Up to Congress." The thumbnail showed Ibrahim Traoré with glowing red eyes beside a shocked Jasmine frozen mid-sentence. But once viewers clicked, they stayed not for flash, but for substance. Toby's video was part digital journalism, part spoken word manifesto. He walked through Jasmine's background, the lawsuit, the BBC interview, and the history of post-colonial condescension, all while weaving in humor, youth slang, and sharp editing. He ended with a simple call. We're not waiting for permission anymore. Africa is done whispering. In 48 hours, the video hit 5.2 million views. Back in D.C., inside the Crockett campaign headquarters, the mood was spiraling. Jasmine's communications director, Elise Chambers, stormed into the morning meeting, her laptop screen still open to a Twitter trend map, bleeding red across the globe. "We're losing the narrative," she said flatly. "This isn't just backlash, it's a movement." Jasmine leaned back, visibly exhausted. "We've issued statements. I've done the press conferences. What else do they want?" "They don't want a statement," Elise said. "They want a reckoning." It was no longer about what Jasmine had said, it was about what it represented. And in a world where perception had the half-life of a heartbeat, reclaiming control wasn't a matter of policy, it was a matter of speed, sincerity, and story. But stories had a new battlefield now. And in that digital war zone, Jasmine Crockett was outnumbered, outpaced, and perhaps worst of all, outstoried. In public, Jasmine Crockett still smiled. She smiled in photo ops, smiled in interviews, smiled as she walked briskly through Capitol Hill corridors, pretending not to hear reporters shouting questions about the lawsuit. The smile had been her shield for years, polished, practiced, poised. But behind that smile, things were unraveling. Each morning now began the same way. Elise, her communications director, presenting a fresh onslaught of headlines, viral clips, and trending hashtags, all with Jasmine's name stitched into the center. A digital cyclone that wouldn't stop spinning. But it wasn't just the internet. It was the silence of old allies. Colleagues she used to text freely now responded with delays. Some didn't respond at all. The Congressional Black Caucus hadn't issued a public statement, but privately Jasmine sensed the hesitation. The air in those closed-door meetings felt thinner, more charged, like no one wanted to be the one caught holding her hand when the music stopped. And yet she refused to back down. "I'm not apologizing," she snapped one afternoon as Elise and her policy advisor Marcus sat across from her in her office, visibly tense. Jasmine, Marcus said gently, "It's not about the lawsuit anymore. It's about your brand. People think you're ignoring the core of this respect, dignity." "I have respect, Jasmine," interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "But I also have a record. I've stood for civil rights. I've fought for education, healthcare, police reform. I'm not going to bend over backward to appease a foreign leader who ambushed me with a global smear campaign." Elise exhaled slowly. "This isn't about appeasement. It's about perception. You come off cold, dismissive." "I'm tough on foreign policy," Jasmine said almost to herself. "That's why they trust me in the committee. That's why donors line up. I built this platform brick by brick. You think I'm going to toss it all away to look soft on a man who doesn't even run a real democracy?" The room fell silent, and in that silence the past began whispering. Years ago, long before the Capitol and cameras, Jasmine had stood on the cracked steps of a public housing unit in Dallas, clutching a clipboard and knocking on doors in 100-degree heat. She was 24, newly graduated from law school, drowning in debt, and running a hopeless campaign for city council because no one else would fight for her neighborhood. Her shoes were too tight. Her suits were thrifted. Her ambition, however, was bulletproof. She fought her way up the ladder inch by inch, handshake by handshake. She sat on local boards, worked impossible cases, kissed babies she'd never see again. She learned when to speak truth and when to smile through hypocrisy. She learned which donors needed flattery, which endorsements demanded silence. And with each rung she climbed, a little more of herself got traded. Not all at once. Never in bulk, just piece by piece. A phrase here, a policy compromise there. Eventually she learned how to wear her integrity like a costume, convincing but removable. Now, sitting in a $3,000 chair in a glass-walled office in Washington, D.C., she watched it all threaten to crash down over 9 seconds of leaked video. But the smile stayed on. Across the world, Ibrahim Traoré's speeches were trending again. Not from paid media or clever consultants, but because his words landed like sermons. On a quiet evening broadcast in Kenya, he spoke not of the lawsuit but of generational dignity. Africa is not angry. Africa is awake, and awakening is always mistaken for aggression by those who preferred us asleep. The clip was shared across continents. Young activists looped it into spoken-word poems. Retired revolutionaries quoted it in op-eds. Even college students in Boston began referencing him in debate clubs. Traoré didn't shout. He didn't mock. He simply spoke with the weight of 500 years behind each word. And the world for once listened. Back in her office, Jasmine stood alone, staring out at the darkening skyline. The dome of the Capitol glowed white against the deep blue dusk. Behind her, her aides had left. The room was quiet. She let the smile fade just for a moment. Just long enough to wonder not if she was losing a battle, but if she had ever really been in control of the war. The numbers were staggering. Within 48 hours, the hashtag #RespectAfrica had surpassed 20 million impressions across platforms. It wasn't just trending, it was surging. From Johannesburg to Atlanta, from Nairobi to New York, from TikTok to Telegram, the phrase had become a digital banner under which millions gathered not just to defend Ibrahim Traoré, but to reclaim something long neglected: dignity through visibility. What made the movement unusual, transformative even, was that it didn't feel like a crisis response. It wasn't a hashtag born from outrage alone. It was something else, something rare. It felt like purpose. At the center of it all was Traoré himself, though he never once claimed that role. He didn't hire a media firm. He didn't beg for screen time. Instead, he did what no one expected. He listened to the youth, and then he handed them the microphone. On the third day of the hashtag's meteoric rise, a new wave of content began to appear on TikTok. The account Traoré Speaks posted a short video, no music, no filters, just the president standing in a sunlit courtyard addressing the camera with quiet confidence. "You've seen our pain," he began. "Now let me show you our pride." The video then cut to a breathtaking montage aerial shots of Kigali's smart city grid, solar farms in Mali coding academies and Accra art collectives, in Lagos robotic competitions in Dakar street fashion, runways in Nairobi, students, creators, builders, no victims, no pity. Just power culture, innovation. The voiceover returned, "Africa isn't what the world pities. Africa is what the world borrows from and forgets to thank." Within 6 hours, the video had amassed 3.1 million views. Young creators began stitching it with their own footage, fashion designers showcasing vibrant Ankara pieces, chefs preparing fusion, Afro-Caribbean dishes, musicians fusing drums with digital synths. The movement morphed into a living archive of Afro-futurism and real-time resistance. But this wasn't simply an aesthetic campaign. It was narrative warfare executed with surgical grace. The comment sections across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube brimmed with emotion. "First time I've cried watching a video about my continent. We needed this. Not just for the world to see, but for us to remember. Traoré is leading a digital renaissance, not a lawsuit." Back in Washington, Jasmine's team watched the campaign unfold with growing unease. "What is this even about anymore?" Elise asked, pacing behind her laptop. "This isn't about the insult. It's a full-blown movement. It's everywhere." It was hard to pinpoint what felt more threatening, the virality or the tone. Unlike the outrage cycles they were used to managing, this didn't run on rage, it ran on vision. And vision was far harder to discredit. Meanwhile, on American campuses, Black student unions began organizing virtual panels under the banner, Respect Africa. One flyer read, "Colonial language in modern politics, why it still hurts." Another simply showed Traoré's quote, "Awakening is always mistaken for aggression by those who preferred us asleep." What had begun as a political controversy had evolved into a cultural reckoning. Jasmine Crockett, once the face of progressive Black leadership in Congress, was now viewed by many as a symbol of a different problem: the quiet ways in which power, when unchecked, talks over those it claims to protect. And yet Traoré never gloated. He didn't spike the ball. He stayed consistent. His videos were never reactionary. His tone never dipped into bitterness. He simply kept showing the world a version of Africa it had never truly looked at, and inviting others to join him in seeing it. For Gen Z, especially those of African descent, he became more than a leader. He became a curator of identity, a calm voice guiding them through a digital landscape they'd long felt alienated from. As the sun set on the 6th day of the controversy, one post shared by a Brazilian Congolese poet summed up the moment best: "We grew up learning how to explain ourselves. Now, thanks to this man, we're learning how to define ourselves." That's the revolution. By the start of the second week, the silence around Jasmine Crockett became louder than any scandals she had faced before. And this time, it wasn't the media that turned first, it was her own people. The first blow came from where she least expected it, her donors. In a matter of days, three major contributors, two from tech, one from pharmaceuticals, pulled their support. Their official reason was reallocation of funds, but everyone knew what it meant. Her finance director, normally calm and optimistic, walked into her office holding a spreadsheet with a trembling hand. "We've lost $420,000 in the last 48 hours, she said, and the DC committee fundraiser next month, it's been pulled." Jasmine didn't say a word. She simply reached for her coffee, though it had gone cold hours ago. Next came the talk show cancellations. She had been scheduled to appear on the Daily Round Morning Matters and Real Talk with Marcus Bell, the kind of shows where she'd built her brand as a sharp-tongued firebrand progressive. But now, one by one, producers rescheduled indefinitely. One host off the record told her aide, "We can't afford to look tone-deaf right now. She's radioactive." But the real wound wasn't financial or reputational. It was personal. On a Thursday afternoon, just as her team was finishing damage control notes for a possible apology tour, the bomb dropped. It began with a Twitter post, anonymous account, newly created profile picture blank. But the post contained a 45-second audio clip. In it, Jasmine's voice was unmistakable, crisp, slightly impatient, filtered through the low buzz of what sounded like a campaign van. The date was stamped October 2019. "No, seriously, every time I go to one of these events in East Baltimore or South Dallas, I have to switch up everything. The way I talk, the way I dress. Half those folks don't even vote, they just want to take pictures and complain. But if I show up polished, they call me fake. It's exhausting." The quote wasn't explosive on the surface, but the undertones were corrosive. It sounded cynical, detached, elitist. And worse, it felt authentic. Within minutes, the post hit viral speed. The phrase, "half those folks don't even vote," became a rallying cry against her. Activists reposted it with the tag, "Shankar, she said," what while former supporters demanded accountability. Speculation about the leaker spread like wildfire. Some suspected political enemies. But those closest to the operation knew it came from within. By nightfall, it was confirmed. The leak traced back to Malik Grant, her former deputy campaign manager, and at one point one of her most trusted advisors. He posted a statement shortly after, "I believed in Jasmine once. But the private conversations never matched the public message. I couldn't sit on this anymore. We deserve better." That betrayal, public, brutal, and deeply personal, shook Jasmine more than she let on. She called no one that night. Her lights stayed off long after the city outside flickered into evening. The Capitol glowed cold and indifferent. The next morning, a new poll was released. Her approval ratings had dropped 17 points, across every demographic. Even among black voters, the heart of her base, her favorability had dipped by nearly 10%. She stared at the numbers. Blank. Still. She couldn't even summon the anger, just an odd kind of hollowness. For years, she had weathered attacks with grit and calculation. But this time, the blow didn't come from her opponents. It came from the story itself. A narrative too big to manage, too human to reframe, too sincere to outspin. Jasmine Crockett was still a congresswoman, still in office, still with advisors and press briefings and responsibilities. But something foundational had shifted. She was no longer a figure people believed in. She had become a symbol of the gap between representation and realness, and no badge of progressive politics could cover that now. The studio lights were unforgiving, bright, clinical, and designed to reveal every twitch, every blink, every beat of sweat. The CNN Town Hall special was titled "Dignity and Diplomacy, a Global Conversation." But no one watching was here for diplomacy. They were here for the duel. Two armchairs sat center stage beneath a minimalist backdrop, the words "truth in conversation" etched in white behind them. One chair was filled, the other waited. President Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in a charcoal suit with no lapel pin, sat with hands folded, posture, impeccable gaze steady. There was no smirk, no performance, just presence, a kind of poised stillness that made the room lean in. The moderator, CNN's Avery Morgan, turned as Jasmine Crockett entered to a polite, cautious round of applause. She wore deep plum, a color of power, but her expression betrayed strain. The past 10 days had worn on her. She sat down with a practiced smile, crossing her legs, carefully microphone pinned perfectly to her lapel. After the briefest of introductions, the cameras rolled. Jasmine struck first. "I want to start by making something clear," she said, voice steady. "I have spent my entire career fighting for justice, equality, and the rights of underrepresented communities both here and abroad. This controversy, this moment, has been taken far beyond its original context. I have never disrespected Africa or its people. What I said in private was careless but not cruel. I stand by my record." There was polite nodding in the crowd. A few scattered claps. Avery turned to Traoré. He didn't raise his voice. "I believe Congresswoman Crockett has indeed fought important battles," he said. "I do not doubt her commitment to domestic justice. But justice is not geographic. Respect is not selective." Jasmine stiffened slightly. "I do not need an apology," he continued. "This was never about personal insult. This is about a pattern where leaders from strong nations use soft words in public and sharp ones in private, where Africa is admired in theory and dismissed in practice. I speak not for ego, but for every young African told that their country is only relevant when in crisis." The room went still. Traoré leaned forward, not aggressively, but like someone confiding. "My father was a farmer," he said. "He never met a diplomat. He couldn't pronounce geopolitics. But he taught me dignity. And dignity does not shrink when others speak carelessly. It grows louder. It stands taller." There was a pause, then applause. Slow, steady, then building. The audience, mostly Americans, stood to their feet not because of nationalism, but because something in the way he spoke cut through the fog of politics. It felt like clarity. Jasmine sat stiffly, her jaw tightening. When it was her turn to speak again, she pivoted back to policy, to her voting record, to humanitarian aid bills she had sponsored. But something had shifted. Her words fell flat, not because they were wrong, but because they were too familiar, too polished. They sounded like survival, not conviction. The audience listened politely, but the energy had shifted. She felt it. She felt the subtle turning of faces, the leaning forward during Traoré's answers, the crossing of arms during hers. Then, without warning, halfway through the segment, Jasmine unpinned her microphone. "I think I've said what I needed to say," she murmured, forcing a smile. And she stood. She walked off stage with her spine straight, eyes ahead. There was no stumble, but there was no applause. Traoré remained seated. He looked toward the camera, not with triumph, but with the quiet gravity of someone who had never needed a podium to speak truth. And in that moment, with millions watching, it became unmistakably clear he hadn't just won the debate. He had redefined the stage. The party line came down hard. The morning after the CNN town hall, Jasmine Crockett's inbox lit up with subject lines she had never seen before. Not congratulatory, not reassuring, but cold-coded and unmistakably formal. "Meeting requested, House Ethics Leadership Subcommittee. Urgent advisory note. Caucus response to Crockett fallout statement. Draft party distancing language. Pending approval." No one said the word censure directly, but everyone danced around it. Whispers of optics and containment circled through the Capitol like a virus. Former allies avoided her in hallways. Conversations dropped to hushed tones when she walked past. The press didn't need a leak. The silence said enough. By midday, the Speaker of the House released a statement praising President Traoré's measured tone and commitment to global dignity. Her name wasn't mentioned. It didn't have to be. In the confines of her now quiet office, Jasmine sat across from Elise and her legal counsel, both stone-faced. The air was heavy. Still, there were no more hashtags to trend, no press conferences to deflect, just consequence. "I want them gone," Jasmine said suddenly, staring into her half-empty coffee mug. "Excuse me," Elise asked. "Everyone, the whole comms team, all of them." There was a stunned pause. "Jasmine, that won't fix this. If anything, it'll make it worse. It'll look desperate, disorganized." "I don't care how it looks," Jasmine snapped. "I'm tired of losing the narrative. Tired of these leaks. I gave them everything, and look where we are." Without another word, she grabbed her phone and began typing. Elise stood, her face drained of color. "Then I'll save you the trouble," she said softly. "I resign." Jasmine didn't respond, didn't look up. Elise walked out. That afternoon, word leaked to the press. A mass firing, a top aide's resignation. Anonymous sources described the office as imploding from the inside. And by evening, the Washington Post delivered the final blow, a blistering op-ed, headlined "Tone Deaf in a Digital Age, the Fall of Jasmine Crockett." It described her not as cruel but calculating, not uneducated but unwilling to evolve. A leader who understood 20th century politics but failed to grasp the power of 21st century culture. The final paragraph cut deep as she entered Congress with the voice of a fighter. But somewhere along the way she stopped listening. And now the silence around her is deafening. Jasmine read the line 3 times. Then she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. The office was dark now, lit only by the glow of the city through the window and the blue light of a silent television screen in the corner. No staff, no phones ringing. Just quiet. On impulse, she reached for the remote and turned on the television, scrolling through old recorded segments. Her face appeared younger, hungrier. A clip from 2016 played her standing in front of a burned-out storefront in Dallas after a protest, bullhorn in hand, eyes fierce with purpose. "We don't ask to be heard. We demand it. And we don't fight just for policy. We fight for the soul of this country." She sat there motionless, watching herself rally a crowd of hundreds, chanting back her words like scripture. Her voice was raw, unpolished, but real. Then another clip. A community forum from 2018, her hugging a grieving mother whose son had been killed by police. No cameras, no staffers, just presence, just Jasmine. A lump caught in her throat. Her eyes burned, but she didn't blink. Where did I go wrong? The question wasn't whispered. It hung in the air like smoke, lingering, stinging. She thought of the young woman in those clips, full of fire, full of faith. And then she thought of the one in the CNN studio last night, measured, rehearsed, calculating. One spoke truth, the other defended power. Maybe that was the cost of survival, or maybe somewhere along the way she'd stopped surviving and started performing. The television flickered. Her reflection stared back at her in the dark screen, older now, harder, more hollow. The smile didn't return this time, not even for herself. The knock at the door came just after sunset. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She was still seated at her desk, the office dim except for a single lamp casting amber light across old papers and a half-eaten sandwich she hadn't touched. Her phone buzzed quietly beside her, ignored. The knock came again, softer this time. "Come in," she said, her voice low. The door opened slowly, and Diane Holloway stepped inside. She walked with a cane. Now age had slowed her body, but not her eyes. They were sharp as ever, scanning Jasmine, with the quiet concern of someone who had seen too many good people lose themselves in the places they once dreamed of belonging. Diane had been Jasmine's mentor 2 decades earlier, a former state senator, a legend in community circles, the woman who first told her that a voice like hers could echo in the halls of Congress if she didn't let the system swallow her whole. Now here she was, not in a headline, not on a camera, just present. Jasmine stood awkwardly, unsure how to greet her. Diane crossed the room, slowly settled into the worn leather chair opposite the desk, and placed a small paper bag on the table. "I brought cornbread," she said. "The good kind, the kind that makes you remember your grandmother." Jasmine smiled faintly, the first real one in days. For a few minutes there was no politics, no scandal, just silence interrupted only by the distant hum of the city. Finally Diane spoke. "You look tired, baby." "I am," Jasmine whispered. "I didn't know how heavy all this could get." "You didn't think power would come with weight?" Jasmine exhaled, looking down at her hands. "I thought I could carry it. Thought I had to." Diane nodded. "You can carry it, but not like this." There was a pause. Jasmine looked up. "I thought I was helping us," she said, voice cracking, "by playing the game. I shook the hands, smiled at the donors, voted the way I had to. I cleaned up my edges so they'd let me in the room." "And did they let you in?" Diane asked. Jasmine looked away. "They did." "But did they let you in?" Diane said gently. "Or just the version they molded?" That's when Jasmine broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. She simply closed her eyes and let the weight slip just for a moment. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. Diane didn't offer comfort in cliches. She didn't talk about redemption or rebranding. Instead, she leaned forward, took Jasmine's hand, and said, "You don't have to know today, but you do have to stop pretending you already do." They sat there in the quiet, two women, two generations, one truth slowly finding its way back to the surface. On a humid Tuesday morning in late spring, the world awoke to an unexpected headline, calm, understated, and yet seismic in implication. Traoré withdraws 100 Mars. So lawsuit. This was never about money. The statement came from Ibrahim Traoré's legal team, distributed not through tabloids or partisan networks, but via a handwritten letter published on the homepage of the New African Review and later shared widely across international media. From the very beginning, our intent was not punitive. It was principled. Our dignity is not for sale, and our respect is not a line item to be negotiated. We withdraw all monetary claims, not in surrender, but in strength. The true compensation we seek is acknowledgement and change. It was a final move in a game he had long stopped playing. Traoré, it seemed, had already moved on. That same afternoon, during a virtual summit hosted by the African Union and streamed across more than 40 countries, President Traoré appeared from a modest room in Ouagadougou, standing before a single microphone and the flags of 12 African nations behind him. His message was not bitter, not even reactive. It was a beginning. Today, he announced we launch the Digital Pan-African Movement, a new platform created by Africans for Africans and for those who believe in truthful representation. We will fund storytellers, journalists, filmmakers, educators, and coders across our continent and beyond. Our voices will not be filtered through pity. They will be carried by pride. He spoke of countering the outdated images of war-torn villages and helpless crowds, of building a media future that recognized Africa not as a monolith, but as a mosaic of complexity, excellence, and humanity. Social media erupted again, not with outrage this time, but with celebration. Creators, academics, and youth leaders began tagging the initiative with projects, poems, and pitches. In less than 24 hours, the hashtag #JapanAfricaNow had been used over 8 million times. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett sat at her kitchen table alone, watching the live stream on her tablet. No staff, no spin, just her and the speech. She didn't flinch at the words, didn't protest the tone. She simply listened. And when it ended, she stared at the black screen for a long, quiet moment. Then she stood, walked to her study, and opened her laptop. No aides were called, no consultants. She pulled up a blank document and began typing, not as a politician, not as a strategist, but as a person finally willing to speak without shielding herself behind the veneer of office. That evening, she released a video message. No music, no flag backdrop, just a single camera and a living room lamp behind her. "I want to speak to those I've disappointed." She began, her voice steady but low. "Not just across oceans, but here at home. I've spent years learning how to defend myself. What I failed to learn was how to reflect. When I made that comment, dismissive, flippant, I wasn't just mocking someone else. I was betraying something in myself. The part of me that once believed truth didn't need a filter." She paused, visibly emotional. "President Traoré's grace has taught me something my ego refused to admit, that leadership is not just measured by conviction, but by the courage to correct course. And to him and to the communities I hurt, I am sorry." The message was short, unpolished, and real. Within minutes, the internet responded not with universal forgiveness, but with something closer to respect. Comments poured in, some skeptical, some warm, but nearly all acknowledging the shift. One post read, "Too late for politics, but maybe not too late for people." By midnight, news outlets called it her most human moment in years. And for Jasmine, it wasn't a comeback. It wasn't strategy. It was the first honest sentence she'd spoken into a camera in a very long time. As the world pivoted toward Traoré's new movement, Jasmine Crockett, for the first time in weeks, did not try to insert herself into the spotlight. She simply stepped back and finally let someone else's voice lead. Months later, long after the hashtags cooled and the news cycle had moved on, scholars, strategists, and social critics were still trying to explain what had happened. It wasn't just that a West African president had sued an American congresswoman, or that public opinion had turned so swiftly, so completely. It was that none of it had been decided in a courtroom. There had been no judge, no jury, no sworn testimonies, and yet a verdict had been rendered. One loud enough to alter careers, rewrite reputations, and birth an entirely new global movement. At a packed auditorium at Harvard Kennedy School, a panel convened under the title Digital Diplomacy and the Decentralization of Moral Authority. It featured international relations scholars, tech ethicists, sociologists, and a media theorist who'd spent the past decade mapping viral movements. Moderator Janice Lum, a professor of comparative media, opened with a simple, piercing statement. For the first time in modern political history, the public judged an international grievance not through headlines, but hashtags. The internet didn't report the verdict, it became the courtroom. On the projection screen behind her, three key words flashed: transparency, vision, respect. Three traits that the panel argued had defined Ibrahim Traoré's digital strategy. He hadn't flooded platforms with counterattacks. He hadn't launched smear campaigns. Instead, he'd spoken in full sentences, shared truths, not slogans, trusted the intelligence of his audience rather than their outrage. Dr. Joseph Ekau, a Ghanaian-American political psychologist, elaborated. What made Traoré's message revolutionary wasn't just its content, it was its tone. He didn't demand pity. He didn't try to humiliate Crockett. He didn't shout. He simply opened the door and invited people to listen. And when people did listen, they heard something they didn't know they needed. Another panelist, a veteran digital strategist, pointed to the TikTok campaign that followed. He understood that Gen Z doesn't want speeches. They want stories. They want identity, clarity, emotion served raw, not rehearsed. Traoré gave them that. And by doing so, he didn't just defend his position, he redefined the conversation. Meanwhile, across the city at Columbia Journalism School, a graduate seminar titled Public Narrative in the New Ethics of Political Coverage had added a new required case study to its syllabus, the Crockett-Traoré incident, How Public Figures Lose Control in a Networked World. The syllabus didn't frame Jasmine as a villain, but as a case of caution. A leader who had built her brand on justice but failed to recognize that justice had shifted mediums. Her story became a lens through which students explored the pitfalls of polished messaging, the perils of offline arrogance in an online age, and the rising expectation for genuine accountability, not just managed optics. One lecture explored how the scandal evolved not through mainstream press, but through influencer interpretation. It wasn't CNN or the Washington Post that swayed sentiment. It was YouTubers, TikTokers, and digital educators remixing Traoré's calm confidence into shareable insight. Journalism used to shape public understanding, one professor said. Now the public reshapes journalism, often in real time. Even law schools began referencing the case not as legal precedent, but as narrative precedent. A legal scholar at NYU observed the lawsuit was the spark, but the combustion that came from people who felt seen, heard, or finally respected by someone they'd never voted for. The trial wasn't legal, it was emotional. And emotional trials don't wait for closing arguments. Traoré, for his part, rarely commented on these assessments. When asked in an interview whether he had planned any of it to unfold the way it did, he smiled gently. No. I only spoke the truth I was raised with. What happened after that belongs to the people. In Jasmine, she retreated from the spotlight by choice and by necessity. She no longer trended, no longer headlined, but her story endured in lectures, in conversations, in digital classrooms across continents. Not as failure, not as scandal, as a turning point, a reminder that power no longer resides solely in title, tenure, or tradition. In a world forever changed, the loudest judgment is often rendered not in court but in comment sections. And the most enduring truth, the internet no longer waits for permission to decide what's just. The cameras were off. The hashtags had quieted. Politicians moved on to new controversies and news outlets shifted to fresh crises. But across kitchens, classrooms, barbershops, and cafes, the story of Ibrahim Traoré and Jasmine Crockett lingered not as scandal, but as a mirror. It had stirred something deeper than political commentary. It had become personal. In a community center in Atlanta, 74-year-old Walter Dean, a Vietnam veteran with a deep voice and kind eyes, sat in a circle with fellow retirees during their weekly discussion group. He said, "What we've been wanting to say for 60 years, Walter said, his hand gripping the arm of his folding chair. "We fight for this country, we bleed in silence, and they still talk down to where we come from, like Africa's a pit, and we're the ones lucky to have escaped." But this young man, this Traoré, he didn't ask for a seat. He built one. The room murmured with agreement. Another veteran chimed in. "He made me feel like we hadn't been forgotten." Half a world away in Dakar, Senegal, 19-year-old Fatou Diop, an art student, sat in front of her laptop sketching portraits from news stills. Her latest piece was a digital composite of Traoré, half in traditional Faso d'Anfani cloth, half in a tailored Western suit. "I used to think no one in the West cared what we looked like unless we were starving or in war," she said softly during an interview with a French podcast. "But then I saw comments from Americans Black, White, Latino saying they had never seen us this way. It gave me pride. It made me feel real." In Berlin, an Eritrean-German startup founder, Daniel Tesfaye, told a tech magazine that his entire company paused work the day of Traoré's AU speech. "We put it on the projector," he said. "Not because we agreed with everything, but because for the first time, someone from the continent was speaking to the world, not through it. You don't realize how rare that is until you hear it." And in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a middle school teacher, Rebecca Mallory, wrote a personal blog post that unexpectedly went viral. "I'm a white woman, grew up in a place where Africa was either a country we sent shoes to or a place we didn't talk about at all. But when I saw that young president speak calm and clear, it hit me I had never really looked. Not with curiosity, only with distance. For the first time, I cared about Africa beyond charity commercials. And I realized that caring was long overdue." Her post was shared by educators across the Midwest, prompting a curriculum shift in more than a dozen schools that added African history and modern African politics into social studies modules. Even on street corners in London's Brixton barbershop, debates raged on for weeks. "Traoré made dignity go viral," said one customer, while another replied, "And Crockett. She just reminded us how easily people forget where they came from." And yet not all voices were celebratory. In Baltimore, 58-year-old organizer Marcia Little offered a more complicated view. "I supported Jasmine for years. I knocked doors for her. What she said was wrong, no doubt, but I still believe in second chances. I just hope she learns who she was before she started playing a game she was never meant to lose her soul to." Across all these conversations across race, country, class, there was a shared recognition something had shifted. A line had been crossed, but also a veil had been lifted. Traoré hadn't merely defended himself. He had invited the world to reimagine Africa, and in doing so forced countless people to reimagine themselves in relation to it. She didn't hold a press conference. There was no grand farewell, no choreographed exit, no dramatic announcement of resignation. Just a quiet message posted to her website: "I will not be seeking re-election. Public service for me must evolve." And with that, Jasmine Crockett disappeared from the halls of Congress. In the months that followed, speculation ran wild. Some wondered if she'd flee the spotlight altogether. Others predicted a rebrand, a new podcast, a book deal, maybe a run for mayor or a consulting firm. But none of that came. Instead, she showed up quietly on the south side of Chicago, wearing jeans and a loose sweater, helping unpack donated laptops at a local youth tech center. The nonprofit Code Horizons had been working for years with underfunded schools and community centers to bring digital literacy to Black and immigrant youth. No reporters followed her, no cameras, just kids' keyboards and a woman trying to find her footing again. Her job wasn't glamorous. She didn't lead the organization. She didn't sit on the board. She helped write grants, coordinate workshops, and occasionally stood in the back of classrooms watching wide-eyed teenagers write their first lines of code. There was one girl 12 years old from Senegal who refused to speak at first. Shy, distant. But during a robotics workshop, she built a small solar-powered fan from recycled plastic and old wires. Jasmine watched the girl hold it up proud and glowing. Later that afternoon, Jasmine sat on the center's back steps, tears slipping down her face. It wasn't grief. It wasn't regret. It was clarity. For the first time in years, she felt useful, not powerful, not visible, just useful. Slowly, the media began to take notice, but not with the same sharp teeth as before. The tone had shifted. A feature in Essence called her a woman relearning the ground beneath her voice. A local journalist in Chicago described her post-scandal journey as one of quiet service, not spectacle. Even The Atlantic, which had once published a scathing critique, followed up with a more tempered profile titled From the Floor of Congress to the Back of the Classroom, Jasmine Crockett's Redemption Arc. People weren't sure what to make of her now. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't a hero either. She had become something more ambiguous, a warning, a symbol of what happens when identity becomes branding, when authenticity is traded for strategic silence, and when proximity to power makes you forget the sound of your own voice. But she was also a reminder that redemption isn't a headline. It's a process, one that happens away from microphones, one that takes root in small acts repeated often, in showing up even when no one's watching. Back at Code Horizons, the kids didn't care about her past. They didn't know about the lawsuit or the controversy. To them, she was the woman who brought snacks, helped them fix their syntax errors, and taught them how to speak with confidence during demo days. One boy asked her if she used to be famous. She smiled and said once, for all the wrong reasons. Then she handed him a charger and kept moving. The courtroom had long faded into the background. The headlines had cooled, but President Ibrahim Traoré was just getting started. In the wake of the lawsuit's withdrawal and the global conversation, it sparked Traoré's calendar, filled with invitations not from diplomats, but from storytellers. He began in Nairobi, seated around a long table at a digital media hub with Kenyan documentary producers, Pan-African journalists, and tech entrepreneurs. The conversation wasn't about geopolitics or aid. It was about stories, about control, about truth. We cannot continue to rely on others to define our image, he told them. The dignity of our people depends not only on policy, but on narrative. If the lens is always imported, then so is the reality it frames. From there, he traveled to Lagos, where Nollywood directors and digital content creators welcomed him not as a head of state, but as a cultural visionary. Over plantain and pepper soup, they talked about breaking stereotypes, funding grassroots media, and building a cross-continental platform for African creators, a network for Africans by Africans designed to rival global giants and reclaim authorship of the African story. In Accra, Ghana, Traoré stood beside the Minister of Information and three of the country's top media leaders as he made the announcement that had been months in the making. We are launching Luminary Africa, a Pan-African digital media platform. Not a streaming service, not just news, a movement, a continent-wide archive of voice, vision, and visibility. The logo was unveiled, a golden lantern radiating light over a stylized map of Africa. The room erupted into applause, but the resonance reached far beyond the continent. Soon after Traoré received 3 formal invitations, a keynote at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, titled Soft Power from the South Media Identity and the New Global Order, a guest address at the United Nations General Assembly, not on military matters but on cultural equity and narrative sovereignty. A closed-door roundtable at Netflix headquarters in Los Gatos, California, where executives wanted to hear directly how they could invest in authentic African storytelling without exoticizing it. Each appearance was marked not by grandeur, but by precision. At Harvard, he stood before an auditorium of students and scholars and said plainly, "Narratives shape nations. And for too long, our nations have been shaped by borrowed voices." At the UN, he addressed world leaders with calm insistence. Respect is not built through sanctions or signatures. It is built through the ability to tell one's story without translation. And at Netflix, when asked how African countries could better market their image, he leaned forward and said, "We are not looking to be marketed. We are looking to be mirrored truthfully." The world listened not because his voice was loud, but because it was consistent, clear, rooted in something beyond diplomacy, dignity. Back home, his popularity surged not through cult of personality, but through trust. Young creatives submitted proposals to Luminary Africa by the thousands. Independent radio stations asked to syndicate its podcasts. Students studied his speeches in debate clubs not as rhetoric but as roadmap. And slowly, almost invisibly, the shape of influence began to shift. Traoré wasn't just reimagining leadership. He was rewriting who gets to lead the story. By the time summer arrived, it was clear that something deeper had taken root. The lawsuit had ended, the speeches had quieted, But the reverberations were just beginning. What started as a diplomatic scandal had evolved into a cultural awakening, not just in Africa, but everywhere Africa had been previously misunderstood. Universities across the continent saw a sudden uptick in foreign student applications. From Berlin to Boston, students sought enrollment in African institutions offering programs in history, tech economics, and environmental science. Inquiries to universities in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa spiked by over 40%, with one admissions officer at the University of Cape Town remarking, "For the first time, we're not seen as the fallback. We're seen as the source." Global research centers announced new partnerships with African think tanks prioritizing mutual exchange over one-sided consultancy. European arts councils began funding exhibitions curated by African-led teams. Public broadcasters in Canada and France purchased syndication rights for Luminary Africa's new programming. But nowhere were the ripples more surprising or more sincere than in the United States. In classrooms from New York to New Mexico, educators reported a shift in student curiosity. Textbooks were suddenly supplemented with podcasts, documentaries, and contemporary African voices. Social studies teachers swapped out outdated maps for digital timelines of modern African innovation. One teacher in Oakland described a class debate sparked by Traoré's UN speech as the first time my students stopped seeing Africa as a backdrop and started seeing it as a player. Churches began integrating African theology and liberation philosophy into sermons. Book clubs selected African authors not out of obligation, but interest. Public libraries added new African cinema sections. Across community centers, barbershops, and youth programs, conversations once limited to American civil rights expanded into dialogues about global dignity, ancestral connection, and shared struggle. In one unexpected twist, a public school in Houston hosted a town hall called Africa Beyond the Headlines. The auditorium was full. Teenagers moderated, parents asked questions. And when a grandmother stood up and said, "I've lived 65 years and never heard an African president speak with that kind of grace," the room fell into reverent silence. Meanwhile, Hollywood took notice. Netflix, building on the buzz from Traoré's roundtable visit, greenlit a 6-part docu-series titled The Lawsuit That Changed the Lens. Directed by a Ghanaian-American filmmaker and produced by an international team of journalists, educators, and artists, the series aimed not to dramatize the conflict but to contextualize the consequence. Episode titles included The Clip That Went Global, #Nation, and Reclaiming the Mirror. Critics praised its depth, nuance, and refusal to flatten the story into good guys and bad. Instead, it explored the power of perspective and how that power had shifted. Across the world, people weren't just watching, they were rethinking. Africa was no longer a symbol of crisis or curiosity. It was becoming a symbol of self-definition, of reclaimed dignity, of modern leadership, shaped not by mimicry, but by meaning. And as those ripples continued outward, they didn't fade. They multiplied. The invitation came by email, direct, unembellished, and personally signed. Dear Congresswoman Crockett, we believe that peace is not only the absence of conflict, but the presence of courage. We are hosting a unity event in Ouagadougou next month, centered on reconciliation and cultural restoration. You are welcome if willing. Ibrahim Traoré. Jasmine read the message twice, then a third time. It had been nearly a year since the firestorm. She had withdrawn from politics, found purpose in smaller rooms, quieter roles, steadier days. And yet when she saw his name, when she saw Burkina Faso in the subject line, her chest tightened with something she hadn't felt in months, fear. She forwarded the email to no one. She told no staff, no family. She booked her own flight. When she arrived at the airport in Ouagadougou, the sun was fierce, but the reception was gentle. No swarm of reporters, no podiums or handshakes for the cameras. Just a young aide holding a placard that said, "Guest of the President," and a quiet ride into the city. The next morning, at the edge of a public park newly designated as a cultural heritage site, a small stage had been erected under the branches of a baobab tree. Musicians played softly on ballophones and chorus strings. Elders, children, journalists, and community leaders gathered not as audience, but as witnesses. At the center of it all, a ceremony unlike any Jasmine had ever seen. She stood beside Traoré in the rich ochre soil, both of them in simple clothing. No suits, no flags. Before them lay a young sapling, Local school children had written words on paper leaves that hung from its small branches: respect, humility, dignity, listening, truth. Neither of them spoke for the cameras. They spoke to each other. "I didn't expect you to accept the invitation," Traoré said quietly, looking out over the crowd. "I almost didn't," Jasmine replied. "But I've learned that guilt isolates us. Humility brings us back." Traoré nodded. "That's why we're here. Not to make statements, but to plant something." They each took a spade of soil. One after the other, they covered the roots of the tree. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves as if to give its blessing. A few people clapped softly, some recorded. Most simply watched. And then as they stepped back and looked down at the sapling standing between them, Traoré turned to her. "History is harsh," he said, his voice low but steady. "But redemption is gentle." The words lingered. The next day, the photo circled the globe: Jasmine Crockett and Ibrahim Traoré, kneeling in red soil, hands pressed to the earth, the young tree between them. For many, it became the defining image of a global story that had begun with a lawsuit and ended with a legacy. Not of perfection, but of possibility. Across continents, the story of Ibrahim Traoré and Jasmine Crockett continued to ripple long after the events had ended. In classrooms, homes, and hearts, people shared how the story reshaped their understanding of race, power, and dignity. In South Africa, a high school girl named Zanele wrote to Traoré, "You taught me we don't need to yell to be heard. Calm truth is power too." In Detroit, a retired Black Marine spoke at a veterans gathering, "I've seen war. But this was a war won without weapons, just wisdom." In Oslo, a Somali Norwegian student said it wasn't just about Africa. It was about all of us who've been misrepresented, misunderstood, or muted. Short films, essays, and songs emerged from the youth artists, sampling Traoré's words, educators building curriculum, churches dedicating sermons to themes of redemption and respect. Everyone from scholars to school kids seemed to agree on one thing. This wasn't just a political incident. It was a human awakening. Even with the progress, the world didn't change overnight. Racism still lived in systems. Inequality still loomed in headlines. But something had undeniably shifted the way people respond to those truths. People began to recognize the power of voice, not just the loudest ones, but the honest ones. Journalists questioned old stereotypes more carefully. Politicians worldwide took note of how quickly truth could travel and how deeply it could cut when delivered with grace. Tech platforms began reevaluating how cultural narratives trend and who controls them. A professor in London summed it up: "We didn't fix the world, but now more people know what's broken, and more importantly, who's ready to fix it." The world still simmered with tension, but the story proved tension could evolve from something that divides to something that awakens. Months later, at the African Union Summit, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a sea of diplomats, journalists, students, and elders. No notes, no teleprompter, just a single sentence on the screen behind him. This lawsuit was a letter, a lesson, and a legacy. He spoke a voice how too often nations are told to stay quiet unless spoken to. He reminded the world that justice doesn't always wear a robe or carry a gavel. Sometimes it wears humility. Sometimes it grows like a tree. Dignity, he said, is not granted. It is lived. He thanked Jasmine not for the pain, but for the process. Without conflict, there is no clarity, he said. Without discomfort, there is no change. As the hall fell silent, Traoré looked across the room one last time. "May we all speak truth, even when the microphones are off." Applause rose, not as a celebration, but as an affirmation. The room stood not for a president, but for a man who reminded them all, leadership is not about being followed. It's about being understood. And with that, the story that began with a lawsuit ended not with judgment, but with legacy. Sometimes it only takes one moment, one voice to shift the way a nation listens. Ibrahim Traoré didn't shout. He didn't retaliate with anger. He responded with dignity, truth, and history behind him. In a world hungry for power, he reminded us that real strength often speaks the softest. Jasmine's fall wasn't just about politics. It was about forgetting who we're meant to serve. Have you ever seen a single act of courage change everything you believed about justice? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.